It's not every day that you hear the governor of the Virginian Commonwealth declare independence from the government on certain policies and issues. That is exactly what Governor Glenn Youngkin has done. And oh boy, the backlash is spicy to say the least. Welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast. I'm Tony Kinnett here on 93.1 FM Indianapolis, joined by the one, the only Gabriella Hoffman from the IWF. That's right, the Independent Women's Forum. If you're not following their work, you should. They're at IWF on Twitter. They're fantastic. Gabriella, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for teeing up the interview and that. And yes, I lead our Center for Energy and Conservation, and I'm really excited to talk to you officially on these interesting topics.
So being the director of any kind of think tank's Center for Energy and Conservation or any kind of group means that you have to deal with the ultra lows and the ultra highs, which is that either everyone on earth is caring about energy policy, or it's like education policy, or just people pretend that it doesn't exist. And right now, President Biden's electric vehicle policy extraordinaire has, it's shaken the manufacturing belt of the country to the core, and Virginia's not even in that manufacturing belt, so to speak. So tell me a little bit about what Governor Youngkin did about this mandate, and we'll just kind of take it from there.
Right. And I want to give your listeners some context. So red states are not in this compact. So this is from California's Air Resources Board, their Advanced Clean Car Program. A lot of acronyms, 2 acronyms, but that's what the official title is. So this law was passed in California in 2012, but Virginia was entered into this compact, and I usually pay attention to what happens in my state legislature. This is when Democrats had full control. And Northam, everyone knows who Governor Northam is. I don't need to explain who he is, but he's pretty notorious. But to atone for forgiveness for some of his crazy statements at the time, he promised to push Virginia on a net zero course as it relates to energy and environmental issues. So among those, he passed like a Green New Deal light, but he also passed our entry into this California dictate, this California regulation that has 2 iterations. So Virginia, what our Attorney General Jason Miyares argued, and then it was also supplemented by a memo from our Secretary of Natural Resources, Travis Voiles. Very easy to read documents. I recommend your listeners to check out the memo. It's like 3-4 pages, explains what it is, but I'm going to summarize it in Cliff Notes version for your listeners. So Virginia only signed on to the first iteration, which said that 22% of vehicles sold by model year 2025 have to be EVs. I don't think they find that standard to be reasonable either here. But our Virginia Resource Air Board, or our pollution board, said and was only found to have gone on board the first iteration, but there's a carve out, or there's like a stipulation that our Attorney General found in his official opinion that said that after December 2021, Virginia does not have to follow what they never voted on to enact this ACC2, this Advanced Clean Car Program 2, which says every participating member, there are 17 states plus DC, that have to follow California's EV mandate, which now says, since this ACC2 portion was passed in 2022, after Virginia joined this, so they found they explained legally that because this second iteration, which says 100% of EVs have to be sold by 2035, all states as part of this, stricter than the EPA mandate. So they found a very creative loophole to say that actually Virginia does not have to participate any longer because our air pollution board did not vote to enact ACC2, even though there's legislation here. So it's a really clever, I would say, mechanism, because they couldn't pass it in the legislative session this year. And IWF and our voice outfit, which weighs in on legislation or comments on state and federal legislation, we were able to chime in and express our support for efforts to untether us from California's mandate. So I have personally weighed in on it. I've engaged the governor's office and his administration on this issue. So I've been following it really closely. And it's much like these EV mandates federally. Virginians, much like most Americans, are not warming up to EV mandates. And poll after poll has showed this here in Virginia and outside of Virginia, that consumers do not like having choices dictated to them. There's only 56,000 EVs registered, according to the Department of Energy. Very few states, even being forced into California's mandate or soon to be this federal mandate, if it's not struck down in courts or challenged legally, or we get a new administration in that revokes the EV mandate.
Right.
It's the strictest standards. This California standard is the strictest thing on the books. And the Attorney General, yeah, and the Attorney General argued that why should we be following, and much like the Natural Resources Secretary and Governor Youngkin, why should we be following a state dictate that is far more restrictive than federal mandates? or federal, regulations or federal rules. And I don't think they agree with the Biden EPA rule. I don't think they do, but it's better to comply with the federal rules versus state rules, which are far more obtuse and far more problematic. A lot of people are pretty happy here. 60% of Virginians, according to the most recent available data polling that came out in January of this year, 60% nearly said they don't support this. So most Virginians are largely opposed to us staying in the EV mandate. So I think most are celebrating. I'm personally celebrating this. And from a regulatory standpoint, I think this is a really smart policy to get us out, because why should we have to abide by this? We live in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We're not at the behest of Sacramento, which is where I used to live. I used to live in California. I had to, endure a lot of Sacramento policies in the 21 years I spent in California. So I left California for Virginia to avoid this. And now it's like following me here. It's very concerning to me. But we have a great administration here, putting common sense policies into effect and saying consumer choice has to be respected. EVs are potentially, questionable. We can't dictate to people here in the Commonwealth, what is and isn't good policy. And it's much like what people are feeling across nationally. Virginia's no exception, but it's a win for consumers, producers, and for freedom.
We're on with Gabriella Hoffman, the director for the Independent Women's Forum's Center for Energy and Conservation, talking a little bit about the backlash that Governor Youngkin is facing because he no longer is going to abide Virginia's weird participation in an EV program and mandate, which is somehow stricter than Biden's EV mandate, which is something special. And we could talk a little bit more about the backlash, but I want to get your perspective on this. How do you think that the Democrat national campaign is making any kind, how are they rationalizing this kind of electoral strategy where they have the EV mandates, so they're cutting off a huge chunk of the country? Secretary Pete Buttigieg hasn't even been able to build more than 7 or 8 charging stations with $5 billion. And then, to add insult to injury, Biden can't even get OPEC, the OPEC, to lower oil or to increase oil production, therefore lower gas prices heading into the election. It's like a quadruple whammy on energy. What are they thinking?
This is what happens when your administration adheres to a very nonsensical, unsustainable net zero climate energy policy. And that's a mouthful for listeners, I know. But since Biden has come to office, day one, everything has to accord with fighting a so-called climate crisis. That's the reason why we're seeing this pushed regulation-wise through different executive orders. And I'm only going to comment on the policy side since I am representative of a nonprofit and I can't necessarily, talk about effectuating, elections. But from a policy standpoint, this is a centerpiece of their administration. And if they were to get another term in office, they would continue and double down on this. And this is not just exclusive to the, energy related agencies. They believe fighting climate change should be a priority all across the whole of government, but especially in the agencies that are tasked with environmental conservation decisions. And it's not surprising that the programs haven't come to fruition because the fact that they're, pumping all this, billions of dollars in federal spending, artificially inflating EV markets, which are not ready for prime time. And even when you look at it in the market side, the manufacturers are scaling back. The car dealers are saying these cars are piling up on our lots. We cannot sustain these numbers of EVs that are piling up. No amount of EV credit is a nice incentive. And I think subsidies are extremely wrongheaded and they've been tried before. It only actually subsidizes people who make over $100,000 who can already afford EVs to incentivize them to purchase it. So lower and middle income people will never be able to have an EV vehicle. Not that they would ever want to with rising inflation, largely caused by Biden's inflation policies. And similarly, as you mentioned with OPEC, why do we have to be beholden to OPEC? We're sitting on so much untapped energy here in the United States. Biden administration has repeatedly said no new oil and gas leases onshore and offshore. They're prioritizing solar and wind, which are less reliable, more potentially dangerous to the environment, have intermittency issues, and don't really do anything. And again, they're backed up by subsidies, everything, like all these, so-called projects that they say are going to be reflected in the market. This is government picking winners and losers, prioritizing solar and wind over coal, oil, and natural gas, which are far more reliable. And natural gas is especially king. Nuclear, something that I think both sides of the aisle want to catalyze, but we see a reluctance from a lot of environmentalists.
You can't just say nuclear and not expect me to get excited. No, please.
Nuclear is great. I mean, it has the lowest footprint of any energy source. And like I said, I still love and still advocate for coal, oil, and natural gas. But the only true, really clean energy source that could replace fossil fuels down the road, but like I said, we're still going to keep them for a long haul because they're essential for life here in the United States from secondary and tertiary purposes as well, in addition to energy consumption and production.
Right.
But nuclear, if you're not talking about nuclear, you're not serious. We've heard little tinges of the Biden administration talk about this. I was at the Politico Energy Summit yesterday in DC, heard from different administration officials. They're very tone deaf. But they're like, oh yeah, we love nuclear, and there are people opposing nuclear. Like they were saying Republicans were opposing nuclear. I don't know anyone Republican who's opposing nuclear. We want
because there aren't any.
The center right. But it's so funny that they still caveat, we need solar and wind, and that's where things are because it's so cheap. But you look at the different headlines, solar and wind are on the verge of collapse, especially solar. Solar is going to have a really bad year because of all these subsidies, this injection of federal spending, which can't rescue these entities or make people incline and want to, retrofit their houses with rooftop solar or go wind or connect, to the grid there. But OPEC, what Biden is doing, tapping into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and begging OPEC to pump more oil. This is what happens when you're weak and when you have fully ceded your energy policy to TikTok climate activists.
Absolutely correct. Again, as usual, if you're not following Gabriella Hoffman, you really should be. I mean, come on. It's the Independent Women's Forum. It's got all of the good stuff that you need. Gabby, thanks so much for joining us.